So why don't we take a little time to introduce our panelists in case you don't know them already. So Ryan, why don't we get started with, you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your ministry context.
So I'm Ryan Ashlock. I pastor in Fletcher, North Carolina. And I first got connected in with some of these guys here in the Urban Ministry Network when I was pastoring in more of an urban area in Charlotte and was doing a doctorate through Andrews, Doctor of Ministry, with a concentration in urban ministry. God has a sense of humor. As soon as I graduated with that degree, they moved me out to a rural area. Although I'm in the greater Asheville area, which is a little bit of a city, but great to be here with you all. I love coming to New York City, getting to hang out with people like yourselves.
I'm Danny Chan. I'm the Executive Secretary and Ministerial Director at Southern California Conference. And this is, as you know, the home of the LA Dodgers and the Los Angeles Lakers.
Did you stay up last night as well?
I stayed up until the inning before I should have stayed up. But I know some of my colleagues did. They won last night. The Dodgers won. So it's 2-1.
Manny stayed up. Manny can tell you who won.
And I'm suffering now. I was just taking a nap. Manny Arteaga, pastor at White Memorial Church in LA, and I've been a part of the group also since that Chicago meeting back in 2018 is when we began, yeah.
Well, that was short. I was trying to prepare my thoughts here. I'm Susan Zork, greatest claim to fame, mother of Nick. My ministry is very circuitous. I grew up singing and always talking about Jesus. I've always loved him, as I said the other morning. It was easy for me. But then okay, you ready for a story? When I was a kid, I grew up in the state of Maine, and we lived very much out in the country. And I used to walk in the woods by myself. I was evidently not scared of lions, tigers, or bears. And I had a bunch of siblings, but I would go out and I'd walk in the woods by myself and have a great time. And one time I was out there in the woods all by myself, and I saw that a tree had fallen over, and someone had come by with a chainsaw and kind of cut it off so that it would not fall on anybody. And so what was left was this amazing stump. And I'm probably 8, maybe 9, I don't know, I'm a kid. And I looked at it and I thought, wow, that looks like a pulpit. And so I went over to it, and it was like just my size. I feel like the Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And there was a big thing in the middle, and there was something on this side for your water glass and for your Bible on the other side and your notes in the middle. I thought, this is so great, and I ran home. And we had become Adventists by then, so I grabbed a Bible and a copy of Messages to Young People. And I went up in the woods, and I started preaching, and I preached up a storm at that stump pulpit. And I did that for a while, maybe a week or two, I don't know, and then other things come up, and you move on, and you pass on. Not pass on. You move on. Many years later, when our 4 children were finally all in grade school at least and whatever, I was sitting in the parking lot at Andrews University, and I wanted to go back and do higher ed. And I'm like a good girl, I'm praying about it. And I'm saying, I don't know what to do. I'm interested in this, that, and yada, yada, yada. And for the first time in 35, 40 years, I don't know what it was, that stump came to my mind. And I, out loud by myself in the car, said, are you kidding me? That's what you want me to do? Now, me, and I'm not a young person. I grew up in a church, I knew no women ministers. The women did not take up the offering in my church when I grew up. And he didn't take the thought away. So many years later, working and taking one class at a time, I got my master's. Taking one class at a time, I finished my doctoral work and did my comps. And I went into a formal ministry, and particularly in education. I have a very unusual, circuitous way of going into ministry. It's not like most of you, even though I am a teacher slash preacher at a fellowship that we have on campus. I think it's an interesting story. It speaks to the fact that we're all called, girls, boys, women, men, little kids. We're all called. And that's my testimony.
Well, thank you so much. All right, we do want to discuss things here. So questions, this doesn't have to be just for our panelists, but since they look very official and esteemed up on the platform, maybe we can start the conversation by just sharing some thoughts or questions that you might like to ask these panelists. All right there.
I have a question for Manny. Being the pastor of Kaleo was a whole different story. Now, how do you handle White Memorial's vision on outreach? How do you work with your leaders to make an impact in a different community?
Okay, for those who are, give a little context.
A little bit of context. The first congregation you're referring to is a congregation that we planted. And we planted it with a DNA that had different forms of ministry as part of the DNA, part of the culture. And it was easy then, because when you design something with that purpose, everything is aligned. When I reached the White Memorial Church, thanks to somebody, when I was invited to go, I encountered a congregation that was very different than what I was used to. And in a very real way, a very insulated congregation. I'll give you an example. When we were going through the fires early this year, we opened up our doors and we became a distribution center and a shelter without knowing what we were doing. We didn't know what we were getting ourselves into. And things evolved, and long story short, we saw about 5,000 families come by our church of people who were impacted by the fires directly and indirectly, because we have a lot of even though we don't have a lot of the residents of the people who were impacted, a lot of the housekeepers and a lot of the landscapers and a lot of the cooks and a lot of the nannies live in our community. So they lost their jobs. As we were doing that community effort, I had a community leader come to our site. He sat in my office. And he said, Manny, everyone knows the White Memorial Church as a church that we can't count on. We know you wear the suits and you show up here on Saturday. We see you. But we know that when it counts, we can't count on you. That was a very difficult thing to hear. And this was the community telling us. It's been a difficult thing to shift its perspective, right? To go from insular to a more other-centered focus. And like we discussed in the group, man, my method, really, there's no sophistication to it. It's not creative evangelism. It's not, from day one, I told my congregation, I only have one thing to say here. I only have one sermon, and I'm going to say it 1,000 different ways. I have the gospel, and I think from the moment we began, we have become a gospel-centered preaching church. And the congregation is starting to get it. My first congregation, we planted it with the gospel at its center. Right now, I'm entering a space where we are, in a very real way, the way Ty said it, we are gospelizing a heavily Adventist culture in Boyle Heights. with a long trajectory. So we're bringing the gospel to these Adventists in our community. And out of the overflow of that, there's a lot of ministry to our neighborhood as well. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you.
So I grew up in a very conservative church, which had a lot of last generation theology. And growing up, we were very, and maybe to this day, very heavy on seminar prophecies, right? Daniel and Revelation. And a lot of these talks had quotes from either Ellen White or one of our Adventist pillars people. And a lot of it was, one day in the last days, we'll be heading for the hills, away from the cities, away from the tragedy. But then I look at our city, a reality, and people will need the gospel there. And so how do we reconcile these two giant thoughts of, these thoughts of thinking? Sorry, I'm lost for words. But how do we bring those two together? Because it seems like they're super opposing views, right?
Yeah, I've given this one a lot of thought. There's a general anti-urban bias that can be found throughout American history and American, it's not just Adventists that have that. Like if you look in the evangelical world, there's an anti-urban bias. Within Adventism, again, we talked earlier, Ty talked about the compilations of Ellen White's writings. That compilation, Country Living, was produced in the aftermath of World War II. I think in response to some of the devastation that people saw in the cities of Europe and just a fear that the world was ending and it was time to get out of the cities, and that time was not going to last much longer. I really appreciated, if we can appreciate a compilation, I appreciated the fact that the White Estate eventually came around and more recently released Mission to the Cities, which is a compilation of Ellen White's writings that's, what is it, like 3 or 4 times as long as Country Living, because Ellen White actually had quite a lot more to say about ministry to the cities than she did about running from the cities. And yet many Adventists still only know the Country Living quotes, and they don't know about the mission to the city. But, I mean, there's a lot we could talk about here, but I think at the core, we go to Jesus himself and the incarnation. And one of the great urban ministry practitioners that I've read put it this way: when God set about saving the world, he didn't mount loudspeakers on Mars and broadcast a message to the earth. He sent his son to move into the neighborhood. And we Adventists don't get that idea. We want to do a crusade and send people who live in the country, in the safety of the country, into the city for a couple of weeks and convert people and then pull them out of the city. But Jesus came and moved into the neighborhood. He moved into the neighborhood. And that should be our model for ministry.
That's a question I think that many people are asking, and there's a couple of different ways to fight it. When Ty was speaking to us this morning, I thought it was a fascinating contrast, the approach that Sister White took to push back against the institution that, by the way, she was a part of creating. It is a mind-boggling thought to consider that the prophet herself was simultaneously being utilized to present truth, but was also learning as she went. And that she could, fortunately, before she died, was able to reflect and try to do some course correction. But what she was trying to do and we saw what happened, is she was trying to push back against the establishment. And then she recognized, I think, that maybe that's not the winning method. But so she began to write. And I think it was in those post years that we get her absolute best work, which was fully Christ-centered, right? Steps to Christ, Desire of Ages, like she, that is like, those are her foundational documents. But I think that was one approach, is first of all that we may be tempted to say, hey, we just got to push back against the church, the institution, right? And some of us are part of that, right? Jesus had a different method. Jesus, while he spoke truth into the institution, because the institution was humanly broken, just like it is now. He spoke to it. He spoke to the crowds, but he spent most of his time with 12 disciples. Like the incarnation, you're right. There was a million different methods. There was a million different approaches. The Roman world was saturated with giant stadiums. There were games that were held. There was a culture of attending large gatherings that used to woo and awe the masses. Jesus avoided the methods of the day that were meant to draw the masses and ooh and ah. Jesus had every ability to be able to levitate and to perform miracles, and he did. He fed the crowds, but that was just like in one corner of the world. And as soon as he did, he retreated with who? With his 12 disciples. Jesus's method was very insurgent and subversive, but it was equally personal. Like he discipled, like his greatest legacy was, of course, that he died and resurrected and ascended and is our high priest. But his earthly method was to focus on the few, which is something that we talk about in our training when we talk with our young pastors, is that we will be tempted to push back against the institution and the convention. We will come face to face with members who will be very, very resistant. But in every single church, there are members that that God is working on them, that they are incredibly sensitive to who Jesus is, and they are passionate and intent and wanting to share Jesus personally. And I think personally, yes, Jesus did come. He incarnated, and he is asking us to do the same. We need to incarnate with a group of people. We need to disciple our own disciples within the church, because when we disciple a small group of people, tremendous power to influence the local church, tremendous power to influence the world. Focus on the small, and just let the rest. That's all I can say.
I want the mic because I've got nothing really to say, except this, and I can't improve those. I loved those answers. I think that there was a time when city people and country people were vastly different. I think that gap is closed a lot. It might be a false dichotomy now. In the world of social media and all that we have, the same kinds of ideas and the same kinds of propaganda or the same kinds of worries and the same kinds of stresses, it's kind of pervasive everywhere. So let's concentrate on this stuff and not worry about the difference. That would be sort of my summative.
And if I may just add one thing, you mentioned a ministry model where we get people from outside the city, we go into the city, and then we pull them out. Yeah. And I think through the years, we've been becoming aware of a different method, perhaps. And that is, rather than becoming missionaries to the cities, maybe there's a greater practice where we develop a sensibility of recognizing how the Spirit is already at work in the cities. Rather than coming in and taking on that presumptuous, right, posture of, I'm bringing Jesus too. Jesus has been at work far beyond, right? And in the most unassuming ways. And oftentimes in our generation, we look down at that Latino church with 50 hermanitos doing things the old way. But we don't realize that the Spirit has been alive and well in that community through them. And I think it's important for us that we develop that sensitivity, that we develop those lenses, right, to recognize that the Spirit has been at work in those communities. Yeah.
Can I ask a question, Todd?
Yes, please do.
I thought you were going to ask.
No, that was the.
So our group over here got into a discussion partly because of my inquiries. So we want to proclaim the gospel. We want that to be central. We know that the gospel is the solution to all of the world's ills. However, or I should say, there are practical ways in which the gospel is being contradicted. And I'll just use this. Actually, I won't use this as an example. I will use this as what is primarily challenging me right now. Like the Christian nationalist spirit. The gospel is the solution to that. And so we could preach and preach and preach and preach the gospel. But at what point do we directly challenge the idols of our day, as our brother was talking to us yesterday about? We're trying to confront the idols of our day. So in this moment, this cultural moment, how do we navigate that? And again, we talked a little bit about this in our group, and Susan shared, and you're more than welcome to share again. I'm not saying not to, but yeah, how do we confront this? How do we navigate this cultural moment where it feels like this is, on some level, an exceptional time? So how do we bring the gospel to bear on this cultural moment?
You know, there are many who, how would I say this? There are certain segments of Adventism there that the primary or the first thought is to hand out a piece of literature, in particular, great controversy, right? In our church, I inherited a church that also a really, really great church to raise a family, but also equally a very inwardly focused church. And it took years to be able to just kind of reposition the church more outwardly. And one day we started to have a block party where we just said, hey, we need to get to know our members. We just need to get to know our community. We need to engage the community. And so the very first opportunity we had to invite our neighbors to come, and they came, and we invited other community partners, we call them, and they started to come. Members were like, okay, but where are we going to put the literature, right? Where are we going to put the booth? And sure enough, there was one of our members who had a booth, and he was very eager on the first interaction with the community was to hand out National Sunday Law and a number of other literatures. And for whatever reason, we have this a culture that says, hey, at the very first opportunity that we have, we need to hit the home run, right? But we're skipping all kinds of steps, and unfortunately, we're missing the most important step, which is, hey, how do you love someone so that you can introduce Jesus Christ to them, right? So there is, some of the same people that I'm finding, some of the same people who are eager to hand out the book Great Controversy, which actually speaks about Christian nationalism at length, have not quite made that connection. It's that the very book that speaks to us, that has been warning us, that has been telling us for generations, look, these are the signs, watch out for the signs, because the misuse of religious authority has always bitten us in the back and will again, and it will be the thing that will be oppressing the church in the future. How do we not make that connection? So my advice would be to, well, let's be biblical about it. And we don't have to look fortunately, we don't have to look very far in our own Adventist theology to highlight the fact that, yes, a Christian nationalism is a thing that we've been writing about for a long time. Let's try to help people connect the dots. Now, I want to say something really quick that's kind of related to this. And we were talking earlier because in ministry, in pastoral ministry, it's difficult. We're finding that even when we attempt to be Christocentric in our churches, that we're beginning to fight. We're getting some resistance. We're getting accused of watering down the gospel or Adventism, whatever it might be. This quote from Sister White is just astounding to me. It says from Our Father Cares, page 97. And she says this: has God no living church? He has a church, but it is the church militant, not the church triumphant. Interesting, isn't it? We are sorry that there are defective members. While the Lord, and so then she begins to talk about the kinds of members that we have in our churches. He says, while the Lord brings into the church those who are truly converted, Satan at the same time brings persons who are not converted into its fellowship. While Christ is sowing the good seed, Satan is sowing the tares. And there are two opposing influences continually exerted on the members of the church. There are two influences within the church. We often think about the struggle that we have with culture and the struggle, and sometimes we think about administration or the institution of the church. She says within the church, there are members that are seated potentially in our churches. There are members who are holding office in our churches. While Christ is sowing the good seed, Satan is sowing the seed. There are two opposing influences. One influence is working for the purification of the church, and the other for corrupting the people of God. Have you ever had an idea, a biblically centered idea or thought or teaching or message theme that was opposed as soon as you stepped out and at the greeting line? Like, have you ever been in a church board meeting and for whatever reason you're getting pushback? Have you ever had a discussion with an elders or a church member, whoever it might be, and you're like, wait, I thought this is a no-brainer. Like, this is something that I could easily sell, and I'm getting pushback. If there's ever a reason why we're getting pushback, I'm starting to believe that, wow, like this influence is real. Like within our own churches, there are forces at work that will oppose the gospel of Jesus Christ. I mean, it's astounding. But all the more, we got to be able to promote what we have been called to promote: Jesus Christ, and Him alone.
Sean, can you repeat your question?
How do we make sure that we are preaching the gospel in a way that addresses the core of whatever ails us?
Got it.
Recognizing that whatever is coming out that is that is unhealthy is a symptom of a gospel deficiency. Yes, and at the same time, there are idols to be actually confronted. And so in this particular moment, to me, a major idol is like the Christian nationalist ethos. So yes, preach the gospel, preach the gospel, preach the gospel, and the gospel does directly confront these types of idols. So how do we navigate that, that tension?
Answering the question indirectly, I want to get back to the answer itself. I think we have a history as a tribe of confronting people's idols and offering them new ones or different ones. And it's still idolatry, right? And I think Ty did a really good job of talking about all the peripherals, right, that we often offer as alternatives to whatever's out there in the world, right? And speaking in idolatry in general terms, really the only way, and I'll get to the answer itself, and I don't know if you want to, because there's a how do you do it, right? Before the how, I want to stress that the only way to confront the idol, to identify an idol, like the only way a person can identify, wow, that Christian nationalism really isn't the thing, right? It's not Christianity. It's not what we are talking. It's if we can identify what the true thing actually is. And I think that happens. I love the fact that you mentioned relationships because we can't bypass that. It needs to be through relationships that we embody and show what the true gospel is. Then will we be able to show the difference between the true and the false. I don't know if you want to add to how do you do it in it?
Yeah. Don't hand me the mic.
Okay.
Could I add something here? So I'll give it a couple examples. So when I first went to my previous church in Bangor, Maine, I was warned by one of my elders, don't preach the gospel because the people here, he liked the gospel, but he said, just be careful because people will rise up and persecute. And so I preached the gospel, I preached my heart out, and people were still like comatose. There was no pushback. There was no like, wow, out of here, pastor. It's when I started actually taking the gospel and applying it to specific situations. So like Paul, for example, in Galatians, in most of his books, the idea that it is you are justified by faith, et cetera, that wasn't necessarily that scandalous to people. It was, oh, and by the way, you don't need to be circumcised anymore. That's what really upset them. Or, by the way, Jews and Gentiles should be at the table together. That's what so it was downstream from the gospel in some ways, but it was predicated on the gospel. So that's an example of what I'm talking about. Like, so yes, we proclaim the gospel, and the gospel has implications for the way I treat other people, and that's what people feel threatened by a lot, I think.
I would love to hear because I think I'm in that space as well, wanting to know the how. I think he has a mic over here as well, ready to.
Yeah, I don't know if it's on. Oh, it's on.
Yeah.
No, I'm not going to address directly, but an idea has been coming to me through this conversation. How many subcultures are there in Adventism now? And can we label them? Like there are subsets. Earlier in the conversation, I was thinking some of the issues, the problems we were talking about is because Adventism has really been taken over by evangelicalism. That's like one subculture, that a lot of our people are really evangelical. Then when you were talking about Maine, I'm not sure that is the total definitions. There's like hyper-traditional Adventists, it sounds like. So you have, that's one subculture, hyper-traditional Adventism. Then you have evangelical Adventism, which is probably mainstream America, like in the Midwest and things like that, I'm thinking. Even probably somebody like Doug Batchelor, I'm guessing, I don't know. Then we have, what else do we have? The black churches are not like that. The black churches have some evangelical orientation and association, but they're a lot more, I think, political, and with it, some of our black churches are much more, I think, alive with the Spirit and in touch with the community than the white churches are, if there is such a thing as a white church anymore. I'm not sure about that either. There are a couple of pockets of progressives here and there. So I think as pastors, aren't we supposed to like exegete the congregation first? I think it might be a good exercise, maybe not right now here today, but to actually go down and make a list of how many subsets are there of Adventists, and how does that affect our preaching of the gospel, whatever we think the gospel consists of? It's just a question.
Yeah. I don't know if you want to open it up to that question, because I was going to... Is that fine? Okay, yeah. So I think, brother, one of the interesting things we've done at our church is we have different sermon series, and one of the series we have done is Kingdom versus Empire. So we'll look at the books of Daniel, Revelation, but we're looking at them through the lens of kingdom versus empire. And that's allowed us to still have a Christ-centered focus, but bring out some of these bigger cultural themes that we're seeing. And it's tough, let me tell you, because I think, we're walking on a fine line. Because we know in our churches, we have people in there that are from every political spectrum, right? Every different type of thought. So how do you do that in a way where you're still telling the truth, right? But you're also being at the same time sensitive, right, and tactful. So it's a difficult thing, but I think one of the interesting things of the series that we discovered is, sometimes the stories have a way of saying things where even if you don't say it explicitly, people will pick up on the undertones. And I remember I preached on Daniel chapter 5. That was the chapter I was assigned in the series. And it was on Nebuchadnezzar, where he goes out, right, and he says, "Is this not the great Babylon that I have built by my mighty hand?" And that sermon in particular, I was very careful in my wording. I sometimes break away from my notes. That sermon, I stuck to what I wrote, because I wanted to make sure it was no ambiguity. And there's a section after that where I said, look, and I didn't mention any names, I didn't point fingers. I said, look, there's nothing wrong with wanting your nation to be great. But when that greatness comes at the expense of glorifying yourselves and oppressing the least of these, then it can be said of that nation, Babylon has fallen. And again, I didn't say any names.
You didn't have to.
But I could tell, looking at the audience, people were like, they were thinking.
Right.
So again, I think what's rich about Scripture is that oftentimes, even if we're not super explicit, right? And I think that's the beauty of narrative preaching. Even if it's not super explicit, there's an implicit message that, hey, I didn't say that. Oh, right. Well, the Spirit must be convicting you then of that, right? Because that's not what I said, right? I'm just sticking to the story.
Yeah.
So it's tough, and I think the reality is, boy, this is a hard time to be a pastor because we're walking on a tightrope right now.
Right. You know what? Seeing these idols and seeing the complexity of our job and how sensitive everything is and how delicate our influence can be, it's easy to freeze and not confront them, bury our head in the sand and move on. But I don't think we have a choice. I don't think that's an option for us. And speaking more to the younger guys, it's never going to be clean. The prophetic work of proclamation is never going to be a clean-cut enterprise. So I serve in Boyle Heights. It's a brown community. By brown, I mean Filipino Americans and Latino Americans in a Mexican American neighborhood. I think half of my congregation, brown congregation, is straight MAGA in Boyle Heights. The ICE raids happened on our street. The moment the ICE raids began, I sat with the how, and I was frozen, bro. I took your approach. I went to the text. Thankfully, it kind of went with the series we were working on. I went to Matthew 25 and showed them a Christ whose priority is one that was addressing certain issues. When he says, when you did it to the least of these, and he includes the sojourner, it wasn't a metaphor for Jesus, it was a memory. Because you're talking about a refugee. And I was able to be explicit from the text, telling, we're talking about someone, this brown-skinned man who had to flee for his. So I was able to say it explicitly from the text. And I think this is the time, while I don't know the how, I want to stress that we need to do something. We cannot shy away. We cannot. Now we got to be responsible with it, right? And in a hot moment like this, it's easy to just right. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that something needs to be said, and we need to leave pastorally and prophetically. A lot of times we compromise one for the other. We need to be pastoral in our prophetic preaching, and we need to be prophetic in our pastoral work.
We talked about something else in that circle, too, that I want to come back to. There's a couple of things here. And it is the pastoral part. We live in an age that, is unique. It's been like this at other times in Earth's history, but not for any of us. And I'm maybe the oldest person in the room, and certainly not for me. And I come from Andrews University, and we have the village church situation there that is very, very different than anything I've ever seen in my life. And I don't know how that's going to all come out. I'm a teaching pastor in a small fellowship on campus that came into being because we knew that there were some undergrads that were just not going to church, period. That's probably not a mind-blowing idea, of course, because we don't require it. But we thought we want to create a place where kids might come, and if they just roll out of bed on a Saturday morning and they're in their pajamas, we're delighted to see them. And we also weren't going to make any delineations about how they were dressed or what they might have hanging from their ears or even their orientation. We wanted to be, back in the day, we called them churches of refuge. I don't know if we use that term anymore, but that was what we wanted to be. In that church, where we accepted everybody. It was all warm, lovey, yummy, friendly. We have a crazy idea. I don't know if we're going to keep doing it, but we just go through the Bible. We just read. My brother here, he was one of our guys when he was in the seminary. He was so sweet. We love him. And we just pick a book of the Bible, and we preach through the Bible, and we try to find Jesus in it. And after the last year coming here, I thought it's not just Jesus, but it's the gospel of Jesus, that we are sinners, and he died, and he came and saved us, and he covers me, and it was really wonderful. And in that church, with that lofty mindedness, I watched one of my colleagues preaching a sermon, and it had the term walls in it. Sorry, I wanted to find the text. You saw me on my phone. I couldn't find it. But we were talking about breaking down walls, and somehow walls came into the sermon. And it was in our present president's first term. And there was a lot about walls in there. And somebody from the back of the auditorium hollered out an expletive at my colleague. And this is really kind of right on where the story you told to us in the circle. And I thought, wow, I didn't know there was that kind of division in basically a bunch of kids getting together and worshiping. So I know it's an issue, and I don't have the exact answer for preaching it from the pulpit because it's dicey. But the pastoral part, I think, is really key here. So I have these people. We have a few older members that come to our church service, and they are politically strong in a camp that I would not agree with. And they invited me to dinner, and I went. And they like me. They don't know. They like me. I've known them for a long time. But there was the conversation was heading and intimating certain kinds of things. And I told them, I love you. And all I know is that at the end of the day, if we can't tell each other that we love each other, then there's something here that's wrong. And it has to be fixed. And that was not a sermon, that was a pastoral visit. So I know it's hard, but Jesus saves us one heart at a time. Amen. And in the church, at some point, it's one heart at a time too, in how we combat the challenges, whatever they may be. The other thing, easy to say, home visits and pastoral visits, that's all. It's complicated, it's hard, and it's too much for any one person to do, or maybe even to do it right in this day and age. So I'm not suggesting it's easy, but I know it's right, and I know it's an important piece. The other thing that Todd brought up, and he talked about in the early church where everyone prayed and things just sort of happened, doors opened, and prayer meeting is not very popular. So, reinstituting prayer meeting on Wednesday night, I don't know if that's it. But I know I don't pray enough about the problems in the world and how I'm going to interact with them, with the people that I meet on any given day and in my church, in my congregation. So I'm just telling you the pastoral part of it. And the pastoral part of it, it has to be one-on-one, and you make visits that are hard, and you tell the person, I know I need to love you. And I know you need to love me, so we're going to have to figure this thing out as a starting point. And I need to pray. And we need to pray. We need to pray. And I don't think we pray enough. And I've often thought, and I'm going to make it, I have faith and almost always assurance. And I have often thought, and I'm just being blatantly honest with you about me, that I'm going to get to heaven, and other than my just thrill at seeing Jesus, I'm going to think I should have prayed more. I know that about me. So I offer that.
Wow, powerful. I really resonate with both of you as it relates to being pastoral. If we're talking about trying to change culture, it's very difficult to change culture from an abstraction, from something that's very abstract. For some people, the nuts and bolts of the gospel are very abstract, and they will often hear an amen and applaud us when we're preaching the gospel because they haven't fundamentally worked through what it actually means. And it's not until we come face to face with something that it becomes fully real. And let me give you an example of that. The ICE raids that happen, which were an affront to me because they were so sweet. I don't have any problem with immigration enforcement. I have a huge problem with blanketed, incentivized, without due process, including in the whole complexity of mixed status people that are being deported. Like I have, right? But it did not, those are all abstractions. It did not become real to me until my cousin was deported. So when we try to speak the gospel, to some degree, it's going to be an abstraction until people come face to face with it. So when we're trying to change culture, one sermon's not going to do it. That's where the being pastoral, I think, comes into because it's over the course of multiple interactions that are not abstract, that are personal. I'm going to give you an example of this. I used to have a very conservative church member in my church. She was very conservative. She can quote Ellen left and right, and any talk of Jesus and forgiveness, and she's like, oh, cheap grace, cheap grace, cheap grace. Like she would be very right. But one day, I got a window into her heart. I attended a funeral of a LGBTQ person, and to my shock and amazement, she was there. And she began to share of all of the work that she had done with dying AIDS patients that were in the 80s and 90s, predominantly gay. And it was because either somebody that she knew or a family member of hers contracted AIDS. And at the time, there was all the stigma behind it. And she recognized that this person was dying, not just dying, but they were dying alone. Because nobody in the church would dare to support, to pray with, or to bury a gay person who was dying of AIDS. So she made it a point in her life to visit and to pray with and to support and to bury any gay person who died of AIDS that she possibly could. And she got known in the community for being the person who would do that. And here we are, of course, medicine improved and, it's still a thing, but not to the degree. And so there she was. And I said to myself, wait, how in the world does this woman that, that I had known, like, have this much compassion and is able to overlook so many things that I know in her theology where it just doesn't, there's no congruence there. Why? It is because this was no longer an abstraction for her. It was a very real thing. And I think what keeps us apart in this country and why we can profess to be a Christian and be so vindictive about the poor and and so oppressive, right, against other people on both sides, should I say? And it is because we're fighting abstractions. But the moment we see people, the moment we help people to see people, the moment, so in our preaching, I wonder if in our preaching there could be more room for helping people to see people in the concept of the gospel. If, like, to do an interview, to do an introduction, to do a small group, to do some kind of an activity outside of the preaching time where people are coming together and they're meeting, they're seeing people eye to eye, even the most ardent, on whatever spectrum, the moment they see somebody face to face, I think it begins to change them.
Wow, I love that, Danny. Let me offer something on this topic as well, Sean, that's maybe a little different. I'm a big Tim Keller fan, and two of his books that I might recommend on this subject, Counterfeit Gods, and his book on preaching. In the preaching book, it's a bit of a complex book. It's not necessarily an easy read, but it's deep and it's good. And he talks about addressing the baseline cultural narratives and how to do that. And for Keller, it's often he positions things in terms of idolatry. The idols that cultures have, that people have. So when we're talking about the idols of a culture that lead to Christian nationalism, our presenter yesterday, who was from Redeemer City to City, who is steeped in Keller's way of thinking, gave us that great model based on Acts 17. And he said, when you are confronting idolatry, do what Paul did, and first affirm what you can. Find those things in the culture that you can affirm. And so when it comes to something like Christian nationalism, what is behind that? Are there things we can affirm? Because every idol starts out as a good thing. Like the ancient Greeks and Romans had the god of the family. Well, families are good. The god of beauty. Beauty is good. You have a god for everything. These are all good things that we can affirm. They just should never be ultimate things. So what are the good things behind the push towards Christian nationalism? And can we as preachers, can we affirm those things? Is it good to be patriotic? Is it good to say we love our country? Absolutely. Let's affirm that. But then let's also explore with our people what happens when we make that an ultimate thing, and that becomes a God. That becomes our source of security rather than God himself. How does that go off the rails? What does that look like? And help people visualize how that takes place. And then what does it look like? Then what is a healthy patriotism when Jesus is actually on the throne? That process I've learned from Keller, and it's not easy to implement. Keller was a genius at that. And I just, find myself often, and I've heard you say this, Todd, because Todd got to actually sit and you got small group classes with Keller at one point. Keller was a genius, and sometimes we wish we could be as creative as Keller in the way he spoke to the culture. But the Holy Spirit will guide us in that. And question the baseline cultural narratives that become idolatrous.
All right, I have something I'd like to add. I know Stephen would also like to add something if we have
these last two, time. And then we're going to take a little break and then come back for our final session. Yeah, go ahead.
Great.
The Stevens will end things.
The Stevens will so again, just speaking to this question of how do we speak to this moment, I've done some protesting with an organization called Repairers of the Breach and also the Poor People's Campaign. These are both largely Christian but interfaith movements, right, that are trying to have a political influence toward more progressive ends, right? And being involved with this, they're organized very well, and you sign some covenants and things, but they really use language of morality and religious values to explicitly influence public policy. And I think that, then I've had other young, thoughtful Adventist friends of mine come to me and ask, like, how do you feel about that? Is that not just another kind of integration of church and state, and is that also a dangerous thing in itself? And I had to think about that for a while, but what I think that highlighted to me was, and maybe a way that we can speak to the nervousness that Adventists often get in congregations when you hear a sermon that gets political either way, is that I don't think we have really clearly articulated what separation of church and state is, and specifically why it matters. Because I don't think we should be, we don't want separation of church and state for just the sake of separation of church and state. We want it because, and I believe like the Adventist theological framework all points to this, but we want it because we believe that on the most basic level, God doesn't want a relationship that is forced and coerced and violent, manipulated. And so anyways, when we bring this into the conversation, the reason separation of church and state matters is because we know that when a religion that has a specific agenda gets power, it will tend to start using force toward whatever its ends are. But there's also a lot that religion has to say about freedom and liberty and giving people choice. And so maybe if we spent more time articulating that reason for separation of church and state, we could also present an argument that it's actually good and okay for us to bring our morals and our religious convictions into the public light and into public dialogue when it is working toward those ends of liberty and freedom for everybody. So that's my thought.
There's so many subtopics come up that I'm listening with one half of my brain and I'm thinking about, I got to think about what that person just said. I'm going back to what Manny and Sean said regarding the difficulty, I don't know if you used that word, of speaking to the issues, right? And how we're in a precarious position. I thought of another element here. We don't have denominational support to do that. As a matter of fact, I would imagine most of us are like lone rangers in our churches. We are responsible, even though we have an interesting thing, and if you look at the General Conference website, they will have policy statements on a lot of these things we're talking about: climate change, creation care, social justice. But somehow we don't tap into that. Just think about like the Catholics, right? The whole Catholic bishops thing. They have clear-cut policies. They may be off to one side during one era and off to the other side on another. But those ministers and other denominations, they're not just lone rangers. They're like stating a position. The funny thing is we have those positions, but we don't talk about them. Most of the time that I've been in the church as a pastor, and now I'm quote unquote in the administration, not really. The things that we get, the resources we get are how to do evangelism, practical ways to report risk. We never talk about the intellectual stuff. We never talk about that. It's like, again, we're out there on a ledge by ourselves in the wind trying to address these things. I think that's something we need to move towards, is seeing if we can get some solidarity so that we're not just saying our own thing out there and getting ready to get our heads chopped off.
I feel like the solidarity, it depends on the issue we're talking about. If there was a Sabbath issue where, we are, let's say, a hint of a Sunday law, I'm sure there would be statements in solidarity, right?
It's come out now. We're on the verge of that.
Right, but you have a population whose tithe largely supports the denomination in this country being targeted by ICE, and we're not saying a single word about it. So I'm with you. I feel like one of those lone mavericks sometimes, and I wish I had the support and solidarity of the system. I get it.
Yeah. Now, I will say that your leadership has put a statement.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? You're not talking about your immediate leadership, right? We do have a statement.
This is awkward.
I was aiming a little high, Yeah.
Okay, we're going to take one last one, and then we're going to take a 3-minute break, and we'll be back here to worship. Yeah.
When I came to Oxnard, it was well known in California that one of my members was taken. And I, with the congregation, tried to do our best to support her. But that upset the MAGA people in my church. And I said, what am I going to do? And my response was, what will Jesus do? So we provide all the support to this girl. She got deported. She was taken to El Paso. My house is in Juarez, my mom's house. So immediately I got contact to help this girl to go to my mom's house, have my brothers to help her in going back to her hometown. One of the elders, the most charismatic elders that I have in the church, that I've been fighting to bring him to the ideal of service as if was Jesus the one serving. He resigned. He said, Pastor, our church is going to apostasy. And I said, my friend, I'm going to be praying for you and your family. Because he said, I'm going to resign and I'm not going to come to this church because of what you're doing, what is going on in the church. I said, I'll be praying for you, your family, and the church where you're going to serve. And may God use you right there. So
Don't send them to my church. You probably did.
So yes, that comes to our skin. And we need to step up. And even though we have people with that mentality, the church needs to continue its purpose. And if they are in the way, thank you for serving the church. I had a board meeting last night, and we told him, thank you for being a great servant during your time here, and we're going to be praying for you wherever you're going.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Let's give this group a nice thank you.